And welcome back. Previously, we had talked about using simple Boolean expressions. Today, we're going to explore what is known as a compound Boolean expression, which is not going to be too drastically different. However, we are going to introduce some new terminology. So when we start looking at these compound expressions, what we're ultimately trying to do is compare multiple items. And if you recall from previous time, when we looked at this, we said, hey, we want to compare two things. For example, we want to compare two strings, or we want to compare two numbers. Well, there's a way we can do this with having more than two things, and this is to use either the AND or the OR operator to combine an expression. So the AND operator we represent with this with a double ampersand, and this, of course, for some people, it's the AND symbol as you might refer to it, but it's called an ampersand. And here's an example. We want to say, hey, if number is greater than 2 and number is less than 7. The other one is OR. And with OR, you can say count is less than 3 or count is greater than 12. Now, with these three expressions, they all have different meanings. And let's actually take a moment to talk about what these meanings are. So with an AND expression, the entire expression has to be true. And we'll look at this with some examples here in a minute. With an OR expression, the entire expression is true, providing at least one of the parts is true. So whether you have two things you're comparing, three things you're comparing, four things, if at least one of those parts is true, the whole thing is true. Whereas with the AND, it's the opposite. If you have any of those conditions are false, the whole thing will be false. Now, this one we did talk a little bit about last time, but we're going to go ahead and give it a little more formality, which is the not operator, which we represent with just an exclamation point. With the not, you can negate any expression, any Boolean expression, whether it's simple or compound, with the not condition here. And so with that operator, we can say, hey, you know what, we're going to use this and we're going to change the value. If it was true before, we're going to make it false. If it was false, we're going to make it true. Now, you technically can avoid using not by using other comparatives, but it is sometimes a nice way to, flip the script, if you will, on whatever that value is real quickly, because you can just say, well, I have this value, I just want to change it, so I'm just going to make it a not operator. So it's, again, another way that you can do it. It's not always used, but it is, again, just one more tool within your arsenal. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you're coming from this with a math background, is there's a small thing to avoid, which is when we talk about, which is string inequalities. We cannot string inequalities in programming. In math, I might say something, like, min is less than result, which is less than max. You cannot do that in programming. If you want to compare more than just, let's say, one or two things, you need to have something that's going to avoid giving you a compiler message. And for that, we're going to have to connect those same inequalities using AND. So, for example, min is less than result and result is less than max. In math, we could just say, oh, we're going to do this one big string of expressions. Well, really, this string of expressions that we're used to maybe in algebra is actually equivalent to this right here. It's that we normally shorthand it to this expression here. But this is actually equivalent to this expression here. The computer doesn't know what this is because it can only process one inequality at a given time, which is why we have to write it out using the compound expression here. If you wanted to do an OR, obviously it would be very similar, but if you want to use a thing that we normally would string together, remember that it's going to have to instead be joined with an AND. Now, that brings us to our final point here, which is when to use compound expressions. Well, the use of compound Boolean expressions is very often used when, for example, you probably figured out you want to test two or more conditions simultaneously. Say, hey, we got 3 variables and we want to compare them. Awesome. Great, easy example there of how we can do this. Or maybe we want to get the opposite of a Boolean expression. We can use not. So maybe we have 2 variables. Let's say x is less than y. We want to get a value of that. How can we figure out what it is? We calculate it with an inequality, and we want to get the not of that so we can actually get the opposite. So if it was true, we now get a false. Now, there are other ways to test multiple conditions, but one of the advantages of having a compound expression is it allows us to test in a single line of code. We don't have to write multiple different branching statements for this to happen. Now, there are advantages to both ways. But again, one of the ways of this is that it allows us to have it within a single code block, so we don't have to have a whole bunch of different things going on. So let's go ahead and do a couple compound expressions here just for demonstration purposes. So I created 3 variables. I got num1, num2, and num3. And let's just go ahead and put these into a simple condition statement. So I'm just going to go ahead and make an if. I'm going to say if num1 is less than num2. All right, and if we evaluate this on its own, let's just go ahead and just print something simple here. We'll just have it say a simple test message. Say this works. All right, now normally if we say this, well, is num1 less than num2? No. However, if we want it to be true, I could make this the not of that. Now, if I just put the exclamation point in by itself, you'll notice that we get a error. All right, and that's because this is saying not num1. Well, num1 is not a Boolean value. We'd have to instead put this in parentheses. And so we would have to first effectively evaluate num1 is less than num2. And so that is our simple expression. And by adding the exclamation point on here, we make this compound. So now it is saying this works. So if we run this, we should, of course, see this works. Perfect. Now let's look at a couple other quick expressions. So let's just go ahead and say if num1 is less than num2. Let's do an and num2 is less than num3. Now, if we look at this one, let's just do a quick systemout.println. What would we expect to happen? So let's say, again, this works, but I'm going to use the capital T just so we can differentiate this. If we look at this, we have num1 is less than num2. We know that that is going to be false. If we look at num2 is less than num3, that one is true. Now, if you remember what we said about ands, with an and, what did we say? Well, this part has to be true, and this part has to be true over here. So if I run this, we only see the first expression because this part right here is false. Now, one thing I do recommend, especially if you're just starting off programming, is anytime you have a simple expression like this, go ahead and just add parentheses around this so that way you can keep track of what you are actually comparing. Now, if you notice, we didn't have to have those parentheses there, but one of the nice things about that is that this expression is still going to be exactly the same. You notice we don't get any new output because all we did was just add some parentheses around this, but it's a great way to visually see what are you comparing. Well, I have this set of parentheses around here, I have this set of parentheses around here, so it's just a nice visual way to kind of almost circle around what you're comparing. Now I'm going to go ahead and just copy this one real quick. And let's go ahead and do the same expression that we just had, but let's go ahead and change this from an and to an or. Now, if you're like, how do I get those vertical pipes? A lot of times this is right above your enter key on your keyboard, because sometimes I do have students who are like, how do I get to this vertical pipe symbol? Because it's not one that a lot of people are used to typing. But if you go ahead and change that from the and to an or, remember, these expressions here individually are not changing. This is still going to be false. This is still going to be true. However, when I run this, you'll see we now get this works. Let me just go ahead and just make this a capital W here just so we can differentiate that. So now we have this works. All right, so it's hitting this if expression right here. And that's because, again, this is an or. And with an or, remember, only one of these expressions has to be true. Now, of course, I could make a expression that is even larger than this. I could make an expression that has 3 or 4 or how many ever expressions I want. And I could, of course, keep joining it. Now, one thing I do want to note is that you don't have to have an expression that only contains ors. You could have expressions that contains multiple ors or multiple ands or a mixture of that. So let me just show one of those. So I'm just going to grab one of these here. So I'm just going to do this. And let's just go ahead and add in. Let's do an and. Let's just say num1 is less than 10. Now, we know that this should be true. I'm just going to, again, add some parentheses here just to differentiate that, to make sure that this stands out. And so you can see we can mix this in here. Now, anytime I add in an expression, I do need to use another compound operator. So I have to use either an and or an or because I'm showing that I'm comparing these. And the way this is going to work, it's always going to work from left to right. So let's just go ahead and differentiate this one. I'm just going to make this first word all caps, just so we can differentiate it. And you notice this one did not come through here, all right? And why did it not come through? Well, if you remember, even though this part was true, what do we have here? We have an and. Uh-oh, with this and, is this part going to be true? Well, the thing you have to remember, again, this is saying it has to be less than 10. If we look here, num1 is 15, so it is not less than 10. If I were to change this to a greater than, however, you notice we do get that value because, again, the and has to have both pieces of this work. And that is a pretty cool little thing here to keep in mind here, that you can string these together, but you just have to remember that it's always going to work from left to right here in its evaluation. And if I ever come across anything that changes that, it could, of course, cause some trouble. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that you could add even more parentheses to things to go ahead and try to test them. So, for example, I could parenthesize this whole thing here. I'll still probably end up getting a false expression, but you could, if you wanted to parenthesize this piece here, you could do that as well. And you could just say, hey, I want to test this first before I test this here. So that's, again, another thing that you can do to help add your compound expression with more value.